Well, the pending Quebec ban on religious symbols for those in the public service, such as police and teachers, has caught the critical eye of the United Nations. To discuss this and other issues on the political landscape, let's bring in CTV commentator Tom Mulcair. Tom, it seems like this government really is immune to criticism on the ban, but so does the UN condemnation of this as a violation of personal freedoms going to change any minds in the National Assembly?
I think it's going to get a lot of attention here in Quebec. And it was interesting, Don, there was a very big poll by Léger, a big Quebec firm, that came out just yesterday. And it showed that amongst voters that are in the younger tranche, the 18 to 35-year-olds, they're opposed to this ban on religious symbols. It's really the older voters here in Quebec and in the heartland who are in favor of what Mr. Legault is doing. He was lamenting this in Washington during a trip, saying, you know, I didn't get elected to talk about religious symbols, but guess what? That's about all he's done. Oh, and he's been attacking the right of the English-speaking minority to have their school boards. He's been adding that one in there as well. With regard to these rapporteurs from the United Nations, they do important work. We had one in Canada not that long ago named James Ayana, very respected fellow, doing work on First Nations and other Indigenous issues in Canada. So I think that they're going to have to sit up and take notice. And I'll give you a little bit of a historical sidebar on this. Back in the day when Quebec had a unilingual French sign, so you were not allowed to go around that law and have a bilingual sign. Everything had to be French only.
Right.
The United Nations, again, came up with a report saying that goes against the fundamental freedom of expression. And it was only once we had that decision, and I say we because I was one of the advisors for Claude Ryan, that we were able to get rid of the notwithstanding clause and come in with a new bill where bilingualism came back as the norm that was allowed in Quebec. So I think that this might also give reasonable people around Mr. Legault pause to consider a possible way out of this thing, because using two notwithstanding clauses, and they're proposing, Don, to use closure to shut this thing down ahead of time. It's unseemly, and I think that most Quebecers feel ashamed by it.
You know, I'm curious how, as you know, and you've seen, we're getting a campaign, the federal campaign's already revving pretty high on the engines here. I wonder how Trudeau is going to handle this issue in the campaign trail. He doesn't want to upset Quebecers by campaigning against 21 too hard, does he?
Well, that's interesting, and I'm obviously going to have to declare my conflict here because my strong stand in favor of the rights of Muslim women in the 2015 campaign cost me a lot of support in Quebec. We measured that. It was in the 20% range. We know about it. But here's the deal. Mr. Trudeau, I think, is playing this one too cautiously because he is somebody who does have principles with regards to human rights and individual freedoms, and he has been stone silent on this thing pretty well since the beginning. The first day that it was tabled, he mumbled something under his breath and then has been hiding about it ever since. It's interesting because if you compare and contrast, I have a feeling that if Mr. Trudeau père was still around, we might have heard a much stronger and really vibrant defense of individual rights and freedoms. The Quebec government goes so far as to say that this bill suppressing individual religious freedom is necessary because we have to support the collective rights of Quebecers. I mean, that is language and terminology straight out of another era and certainly straight out of another legal system.
All right. So we'll see how he goes on that one. Another election issue, and I think you might want to venture into this as a former federal NDP party leader. We've got Alberta Premier Jason Kenney. He's threatening to wade into the federal election campaign by coming to Ontario to help the Conservatives on this road to victory. I mean, you ever heard of a premier going out of his province to campaign? And I'm wondering, is it a help or hindrance for Andrew Scheer?
I think it's a two-edged sword, as you say in your question, Don, because, of course, Jason Kenney has no limitations on his high opinion of his opinions, but at the same time, I think that Doug Ford is not being very prudent. If he thinks that the two of them can redo the front cover of Maclean's where they posed with Andrew Scheer as the resistance, I think they'll be playing right into Justin Trudeau's hands. Mr. Trudeau is going to make this about character. We're seeing how strongly he's hitting the abortion issue and trying to tag Mr. Scheer for his strongly held personal beliefs, but his political beliefs are no different from those of Mr. Harper, who said, I'm not going to touch this thing, and Andrew Scheer very credibly says he won't touch it either, and there's no reason not to believe him on that. But again, they're trying to make this the same type of very dark campaign that was waged by the NDP in Alberta against Mr. Kenney himself, and he should have learned an object lesson from that. In Canada, that stuff doesn't work that well. People want to know what your ideas are, what you're planning to do, not necessarily why the other guy is so awful. So I think that Mr. Kenney better talk to Mr. Scheer in advance. I'm not sure Andrew Scheer is going to be well served by the Doug Ford, Jason Kenney combo trying to help him out.
Well, one thing I'll say about Kenney, as distinct from perhaps Ford at this point in time, is Kenney is certainly plugged into ethnic, visible minority communities. I mean, he was a minister of immigration. He's got a lot of cachet in there. Used to call him the minister of curry in a hurry. And it seems to me that he might be able to do some good in that constituency, even though some people might look at him and say, hey, you're the carbon price hater, and maybe you're the climate change denier. So they might look at him differently in some areas, don't you think?
I think that if he were to visit those ethno-cultural communities throughout Alberta every time Andrew Scheer was visiting, it would help Mr. Scheer. I think if Mr. Kenney believes he can go into the 905 in the Greater Toronto area and somehow work magic with communities who have no connection to him for years and believe that they're going to have nothing but fond memories of the Conservatives when they had, you were going to be filling out forms about barbarians and barbarous practices and the like. There's not only good stuff that people remember from the Harper era with regard to targeting minority communities. Mr. Harper was very tough on Islam, on Muslim women in particular, and their rights, their religious rights. So I think that Mr. Kenney would do well to try to help in his home province, where he is indeed popular. Moving that east to Ontario, I don't think it's going to work.
All right, we'll have to see. It's still a work in progress. Thank you, Tom Mulcair. Appreciate your time.
All the best, Don.